The biggest lies are often the ones we never realize we are telling ourselves. If someone had asked me a year ago whether I could ever fall in love with another man, I would have answered without hesitation. Absolutely not. My life felt ordinary, predictable, and perfectly understood. I was 29 years old, worked as a marketing strategist in Seattle, spent weekends watching baseball with friends, called my parents every Sunday evening, and had dated women throughout my adult life. Nothing about my story suggested that I was about to question one of the few things I believed I knew with complete certainty. I never spent time wondering about labels because I never felt the need to. As far as I understood myself, I was straight, and that was simply another ordinary fact about my life. Everything began changing on a rainy Monday morning when our company announced that a new senior project manager would be joining our department. The introduction happened during our weekly meeting in a bright conference room overlooking downtown Seattle. People greeted him politely as our director described his experience and welcomed him to the team. Then he smiled. His name was Landon Hayes, and there was something immediately reassuring about the way he carried himself. He did not try to impress anyone. He simply spoke with quiet confidence, thanked everyone for the warm welcome, and listened more than he talked. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and effortlessly masculine, with straight blonde hair neatly styled, clear blue eyes, and a calm expression that somehow made the room feel less tense. I noticed those details only because everyone else seemed to notice them too, or at least that was the explanation I gave myself. When the meeting ended, I introduced myself while carrying my laptop toward the hallway. "If you ever need help finding your way around the office, let me know," I said. He smiled warmly and shook my hand. "I appreciate that. First days always feel a little overwhelming." His handshake was firm, his voice relaxed, and before either of us realized it, we spent nearly 10 minutes talking about favorite coffee shops near the office, hiking trails around Washington, and the best local seafood restaurants. It felt surprisingly easy, almost as though we had known each other longer than 10 minutes. The rest of the week moved quickly. We happened to work together on a client presentation, shared lunch with the same group of coworkers twice, and discovered that we both preferred independent bookstores over shopping malls and quiet weekend road trips over crowded parties. Every conversation felt natural. There was never any awkward silence or pressure to keep talking. Somehow the words simply came. By Friday afternoon, several coworkers joked that Landon had already become part of the team. As everyone packed their bags to leave for the weekend, a heavy rainstorm rolled across the city. I reached for my umbrella only to realize I had left it at home. Before I could decide whether to wait out the weather, Landon stopped beside my desk. "I parked across the street," he said. "We can share mine if you are heading toward the garage." I thanked him, and together we walked beneath the same umbrella through the steady rain while laughing about how unpredictable Pacific Northwest weather could be. Nothing unusual happened during that short walk, yet when I arrived home later that evening, I caught myself smiling as I remembered our conversation. I immediately dismissed the thought. He was simply a genuinely kind person. Anyone would enjoy spending time with someone like him. That explanation made perfect sense until the following Monday morning, when I walked into the office, glanced across the room without thinking, and felt unexpectedly relieved the moment I saw that Landon was already there. Seeing Landon already sitting at his desk brought an unexpected sense of comfort that I quickly dismissed as nothing more than appreciation for having a dependable coworker. I waved as I walked toward my office, and he returned the gesture with the same easy smile that somehow made Monday mornings feel less exhausting. Before long we were assigned to another client presentation together, which meant several afternoons spent reviewing marketing proposals, comparing notes, and refining ideas inside one of the smaller conference rooms overlooking the Seattle skyline. Working with him was surprisingly effortless. He listened carefully before speaking, encouraged every idea instead of competing with it, and somehow made even stressful deadlines feel manageable. During lunch breaks we discovered even more similarities. We both preferred quiet coffee shops over crowded restaurants, loved exploring independent bookstores, and never turned down the opportunity for a weekend drive through the mountains. Our conversations never felt forced. Sometimes we talked for an hour without noticing the time. Other times we worked side by side in comfortable silence, interrupted only by the sound of keyboards and occasional laughter. Around the office, people quickly noticed how naturally we worked together. One afternoon our coworker Melissa looked up from her laptop and smiled. "You two solve problems faster than anyone else on this floor." I laughed. "That is because Landon actually reads my emails before meetings." He grinned. "That seems like a reasonable strategy." Everyone laughed before returning to work, and the moment passed as nothing more than friendly office humor. Yet later that day I found myself looking forward to our next conversation without understanding why. Midweek, our team decided to grab coffee from a small cafe a few blocks away after finishing a major presentation. The autumn air was cool, and the sidewalks were crowded with office workers heading home. While we waited for our drinks, the barista accidentally placed only one pastry on the counter even though Landon had ordered two. Without hesitation he slid the single pastry toward me. "You take it," he said. "You skipped lunch finishing those revisions." I shook my head. "You ordered it." He smiled. "I can always get another one." It was such a small gesture that it should not have mattered, yet I caught myself thinking about it long after we returned to the office. That evening, while driving home through Seattle traffic, I realized I could remember dozens of details about Landon already, from how he always ordered black coffee to the way he unconsciously straightened framed pictures whenever they hung crooked on office walls. The realization made me laugh at myself. I had simply made a good friend. There was nothing unusual about paying attention to someone you respected. The following Friday our department held an informal gathering on the rooftop terrace after work to celebrate completing a successful project. Music played softly while coworkers talked beneath strings of warm lights overlooking the city. Landon stood across the terrace speaking with several people from another department. I was in the middle of a conversation when I noticed one of the new employees laughing as she lightly touched his arm. Without warning, a strange feeling settled in my chest. It disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived, but for a brief moment I felt something I could not explain. I quietly looked away and reminded myself that it had nothing to do with me. A few minutes later Landon walked over carrying two sparkling waters. "I figured you would want one," he said casually before handing me the bottle without asking. I smiled. "You remembered." "Of course," he replied. "You always choose this instead of soda." His answer should have felt ordinary, yet somehow it stayed with me the entire weekend. Then, early Monday morning, I arrived at the office to find an envelope resting neatly on Landon's desk with the words, "Confidential Career Opportunity," printed across the front, and for reasons I could not begin to understand, my heart suddenly felt much heavier than it should have. The envelope stayed on Landon's desk all morning, and although I told myself it was none of my business, I caught my eyes drifting toward it every time I walked past his office. Eventually he noticed me looking and smiled. "Nothing dramatic," he said as he tucked the envelope into his desk drawer. "Just an opportunity the company asked me to consider." I forced an easy smile. "That sounds like good news." He nodded. "Maybe. I still have a lot to think about." His answer should have ended the conversation, yet I spent the rest of the morning wondering what kind of opportunity could require so much consideration. By lunchtime we followed our usual routine and walked to the small cafe around the corner. The familiar smell of fresh coffee and baked bread filled the room as we settled into our favorite table near the front window. Landon seemed relaxed, asking about my weekend and laughing at a story about my father trying to assemble a backyard grill without reading the instructions. For a while everything felt completely normal again. Then he casually mentioned that the opportunity might involve relocating if he accepted it. My smile remained in place, but something inside me tightened without warning. "Would you actually leave Seattle?" I asked, trying to sound curious rather than concerned. He stirred his coffee before answering. "I honestly do not know yet. It is a good opportunity professionally, but moving is never a simple decision." I nodded, pretending the conversation did not matter nearly as much as it suddenly did. After lunch we returned to work, but concentrating became unexpectedly difficult. Every time I imagined our office without Landon, it felt strangely empty. I told myself that anyone would miss a good coworker and close friend. That explanation sounded reasonable enough that I accepted it without questioning anything further. Later that afternoon our department gathered in the conference room for a planning session with another team. While everyone discussed schedules and deadlines, I noticed Landon sitting across the table taking careful notes. At one point he looked up, caught me watching him, and smiled briefly before returning to the meeting. I immediately looked down at my notebook, embarrassed for reasons I could not explain. The moment lasted only a second, yet it stayed in my mind for the rest of the afternoon. After work I met my longtime friend Tyler for dinner. We had known each other since college, and he was one of the few people who could always tell when something was bothering me. Halfway through our meal he leaned back in his chair and laughed. "You have mentioned this new guy from work at least 6 times tonight." I frowned. "Have I?" "You definitely have." He grinned. "Sounds like you finally found a best friend at the office." I laughed with obvious relief. "That is exactly what it is. He is just easy to be around." Tyler nodded thoughtfully. "Those friendships are rare. Do not take them for granted." His words followed me all the way home. That weekend Landon invited me to visit an independent bookstore hosting an author event. We spent nearly 2 hours browsing shelves, recommending novels, and joking about how impossible it was to leave without buying more books than we planned. As we walked toward the parking lot carrying paper bags filled with new releases, an elderly cashier smiled warmly and called after us. "You two make a wonderful couple." I stopped walking immediately, ready to politely explain the misunderstanding, but before I could speak, Landon simply smiled graciously, thanked her, and kept walking. Once we reached the sidewalk, I laughed awkwardly. People really do make strange assumptions sometimes. Landon looked at me for a brief moment before quietly answering, "Sometimes they notice things we never stop to consider." His words were gentle, almost thoughtful, and for the first time since meeting him, I found myself unable to think of any reply at all. For the rest of the weekend, I kept replaying Landon's quiet response in my mind. "Sometimes they notice things we never stop to consider." The words were simple, yet they followed me everywhere. I tried convincing myself that the bookstore employee had merely misunderstood 2 friends spending time together. That explanation should have been enough. Instead, I found myself wondering why Landon had answered so calmly, as though the comment had not surprised him at all. Monday morning arrived with the familiar rhythm of meetings, emails, and project deadlines, but my thoughts wandered far more often than usual. Around mid-morning, Melissa stopped by my desk carrying a stack of reports. She smiled as she handed them to me. "You and Landon have become the office dream team." I laughed politely. "We just work well together." She nodded. "That is obvious. I have never seen either of you look more relaxed than when you are solving problems together." Her observation seemed harmless, yet it stayed with me long after she walked away. Later that afternoon Landon and I met with a client downtown. The presentation went smoothly, and afterward we decided to walk a few blocks before returning to the office. Autumn had settled comfortably over Seattle, filling the sidewalks with orange leaves and cool air. We talked about everything except work, discussing favorite childhood vacations, family traditions, and the books we hoped to read before the end of the year. At one point I laughed so hard at one of his stories that several people passing us smiled in our direction. I realized I could not remember the last time conversation had felt so completely effortless with anyone. Halfway through our walk, Landon's phone rang. He glanced at the screen before answering. "Hello." "Yes, this is Landon." His expression became noticeably more serious as he listened. After a minute he thanked the caller and ended the conversation. "Everything all right?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "That was the regional director. They want to schedule my final interview for the position we talked about. I forced another encouraging smile. Congratulations. That sounds like a great opportunity. It does, he admitted. The interview is next week. My chest tightened again, although I immediately reminded myself that friends naturally wanted the best for each other. Still, the thought of him leaving Seattle seemed impossible to ignore. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. That evening, after arriving home, I called my older sister, Rachel. She had always been the person I trusted most whenever I needed perspective. We talked about work for a while before I casually mentioned Landon and the possible transfer. Rachel listened patiently before asking a question that caught me completely off guard. If he accepts the position, what worries you the most? I answered without thinking. I would miss him. She laughed gently. Of course you would. He sounds like a wonderful friend. I agreed immediately, yet the conversation did not end there. After a brief pause she added, Nathan, when you talk about him, you sound happier than you do when you describe anything else happening in your life. I stared out my apartment window without responding. Before I could find the right words, she continued. I am not telling you what those feelings mean. I am only saying you should be honest with yourself before life makes the decision for you. After we ended the call, I sat alone in silence for nearly an hour. Every memory from the past few months surfaced one after another, and for the first time I stopped trying to explain them away. The following morning I arrived at the office earlier than usual. As I walked toward my desk, I noticed Landon standing beside the conference room speaking quietly with our director. The meeting ended moments later, and as our director walked away, Landon turned toward me with a thoughtful expression before saying, Nathan, there is something important I need to tell you after work today. The rest of the workday passed more slowly than any I could remember. Every time I looked up from my computer, I found myself wondering what Landon needed to tell me and whether it had anything to do with the transfer opportunity. We still worked together as naturally as always, discussing client revisions, reviewing campaign schedules, and exchanging the occasional joke that made the afternoon move a little faster, yet beneath every conversation I sensed that both of us were waiting for the office to empty. By 5:30, the lights across the floor began switching off one by one as coworkers headed home. Landon walked over to my desk with his jacket folded across one arm and smiled gently. Would you mind taking a walk before you drive home? I nodded immediately. We left the building together and crossed the street toward the small waterfront park overlooking Elliott Bay. The evening sky was painted with soft shades of orange and blue while ferries moved quietly across the water. For several minutes we simply walked side by side without speaking. It reminded me of every other peaceful conversation we had shared over the past few months, yet this time the silence carried a different weight. Eventually Landon stopped near the railing and looked out toward the bay. I had my final interview today, he said. I took a slow breath before answering. How did it go? He smiled modestly. Better than I expected. I genuinely meant the next words. You deserve it. He turned toward me with an expression that mixed gratitude and uncertainty. The position is mine if I want it. Although I had expected that answer, hearing it aloud felt strangely different. I forced another smile. Congratulations. He nodded but did not seem excited. Instead he looked back toward the water. The problem is that the position is in Boston. The sentence settled heavily between us. I stared across the harbor without knowing what to say. Part of me wanted to encourage him to accept such an incredible opportunity. Another part quietly wished the offer had never appeared. Halfway through the silence he asked a question that caught me completely off guard. If I leave, do you think anything between us changes? I laughed nervously. You will still be one of my closest friends. Even as I spoke the words, they sounded incomplete. Landon smiled politely, but something in his eyes suggested he had hoped for a different answer. We continued walking until we reached a small bench overlooking the marina. The breeze carried the smell of saltwater while evening lights reflected across the bay. Nathan, he said quietly, there is another reason I have been struggling with this decision. I looked at him, waiting. He took a slow breath before continuing. Leaving would probably make it easier for me to move on from feelings I have been trying to ignore for a long time. My heart began beating faster. I searched his face, suddenly understanding that this conversation was no longer about career opportunities. What do you mean? I asked softly. Landon looked down for a brief moment before meeting my eyes again. I have cared about someone here for much longer than I ever planned to. Neither of us spoke after that. The only sounds came from distant boats and the quiet wind moving across the water. I wanted to ask who he meant, yet a part of me was suddenly afraid of the answer. We eventually walked back toward the parking lot together, speaking only about ordinary things as though nothing significant had happened. When we reached our cars, Landon smiled with the same kindness he had always shown me. I think you deserve to know the whole truth, he said. Tomorrow evening. If you are willing to listen, I will tell you exactly who I have been trying to forget all this time. The following days seemed determined to test every ounce of patience I possessed. I tried concentrating on campaign reports, client emails, and presentation revisions, but my mind returned to the same unanswered question every few minutes. Who was the person Landon had been trying to forget? Each time I considered possible answers, I immediately dismissed the uncomfortable thought that kept quietly returning. It could not possibly be me. By every measure I had always understood myself as a straight man. Landon knew that. He would never place me in an impossible situation. That explanation felt logical enough to carry me through the workday, even if it failed to quiet the growing uneasiness in my chest. Shortly after 6 o'clock we met outside the office and drove separately to Kerry Park, one of the places Landon had once told me offered the best evening view of Seattle. The skyline glowed beneath the fading sunlight while Mount Rainier stood quietly in the distance. We stood beside the overlook for several minutes without speaking, watching the city lights slowly appear one by one. Finally Landon broke the silence. I almost accepted the Boston position yesterday, he said calmly. Then I realized I would only be moving because staying here had become too difficult. I looked at him carefully. Because of the person you told me about? He nodded once. Yes. My heart began beating noticeably faster. Landon rested both hands in his jacket pockets before continuing. I spent months convincing myself the feelings would eventually disappear. I reminded myself every day that nothing good would come from hoping for something that probably could never happen. His voice remained steady, but I could hear the quiet honesty beneath every word. I swallowed hard before asking, does this person know how you feel? He smiled faintly. No. I never wanted to place that weight on him. The last word caught my attention immediately. Him. I felt my thoughts pause completely. Landon looked toward the city instead of at me. He is one of the kindest people I have ever met. He makes ordinary days feel lighter without realizing it. He remembers everyone's birthday except his own. He buys books faster than he can finish reading them. He apologizes when other people bump into him. I laughed softly despite the tension because every description sounded strangely familiar. Halfway through his explanation, an uncomfortable realization slowly formed inside me. Every detail he mentioned belonged to me. Before I could stop myself, I quietly asked, Landon, are you talking about me? He finally turned toward me. There was no hesitation in his expression, only calm sincerity. Yes. The single word seemed to quiet the entire world around us. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. I searched for the right response but found nothing that felt honest enough. Landon saved me from forcing an answer. Nathan, I am not telling you this because I expect anything from you. I know how you see yourself, and I respect that completely. I only realized I could not leave Seattle without being truthful at least once. If Boston is the next chapter of my life, I wanted it to begin without pretending I never cared. His words carried no pressure, no disappointment, only quiet acceptance. I looked back across the skyline, remembering every coffee, every lunch break, every bookstore visit, every conversation that somehow became the highlight of my week. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I was capable of loving another man. Instead, I found myself asking one much simpler question. Why had losing Landon frightened me more than anything else in recent years? We eventually walked back toward our cars together, speaking very little. Before getting inside his truck, Landon smiled gently and said, "Take all the time you need. Whatever happens, I will always be grateful that you were part of my life." I watched him drive away, then sat alone in my own car for several minutes. Just as I reached for the ignition, my phone lit up with a text message from my sister Rachel. It contained only one sentence, but somehow it arrived at exactly the moment I needed to read it. Sometimes the answer you are looking for is hidden inside the question you are too afraid to ask yourself. Nearly every thought I had over the next few days returned to the same moment at Kerry Park. I could still hear Landon's calm voice, still remember the sincerity in his eyes when he admitted that I was the person he had quietly loved all along. What surprised me most was not his confession. It was my own reaction afterward. I had expected panic, confusion, or the need to distance myself. Instead, I felt an overwhelming fear that he might actually leave Seattle before I understood what my own heart was trying to tell me. Work continued as usual, but everything looked different. Every morning I found myself hoping Landon would already be at the office when I arrived. Every lunch break felt more valuable because I no longer assumed there would always be another one. I began noticing the smallest details with unusual clarity. The way he always held the office door open for everyone behind him. The way he quietly stayed late whenever someone on the team needed help finishing a project. The way he remembered my favorite coffee order without ever asking whether I wanted one. None of those things were new. I was simply seeing them without the comfortable excuses I had relied on for months. Halfway through the week, Melissa stopped beside my desk with a cheerful smile. "The company is planning a farewell reception next Friday," she said. "It looks like Landon is seriously considering Boston." My stomach tightened. "Has he accepted already?" She shrugged. "Not officially, but Human Resources is already preparing everything just in case." After she walked away, I stared at my computer screen without reading a single word. The possibility that had once seemed distant suddenly felt painfully real. That evening I drove to my parents' house for dinner. My father talked enthusiastically about football while my mother described plans for Thanksgiving, yet I found myself unusually quiet. After dinner my mother followed me onto the back porch with 2 mugs of hot tea. She smiled gently before speaking. "You have the same thoughtful expression you wore when you were deciding whether to change careers." I laughed softly. "Is it really that obvious?" "Only to people who know you well." I hesitated before telling her everything. I described meeting Landon, our friendship, the possible move to Boston, and finally his confession. She listened without interrupting, her expression never changing. When I finished, she asked only one question. "When he told you how he felt, what frightened you the most?" I looked down at the steam rising from my tea before answering honestly. "The idea that I might lose him." She nodded slowly. "Nathan, you have spent your entire life believing you needed every answer before taking the first step. Sometimes the heart works the other way around." Her words stayed with me all the drive home. That night I opened the photo gallery on my phone. Without realizing it, I had collected dozens of pictures from the past several months. Office celebrations. Weekend bookstore visits. Hiking trails. Coffee cups. Ferry rides. Nearly every happy memory included Landon somewhere in the frame. I smiled as I remembered each moment, and then another realization quietly settled into place. I had never once imagined a future that did not include him. It was never about proving whether I was straight, gay, or anything else. The only question that truly mattered was whether I wanted Landon beside me when I imagined the rest of my life. The answer arrived with surprising peace. The following morning I walked into the office determined to speak with him, only to discover his desk completely empty. His laptop was gone, his notebooks had been packed away, and a small calendar no longer hung beside his monitor. Before I could ask anyone what had happened, Melissa looked up and quietly said, "Nathan, you need to come to the conference room right now." Nothing prepared me for what I saw when I reached the conference room. The space had been decorated with simple blue and white balloons, a table of pastries, fresh coffee, and a banner that read, "Thank you, Landon." Coworkers gathered in small groups, talking quietly while waiting for the farewell reception to begin. My heart sank. Somehow seeing that banner made everything feel real in a way no conversation ever had. Melissa walked beside me and smiled gently. "His official announcement is this morning. The company wanted everyone together before he leaves next week." I nodded, but the words barely reached me. I looked across the room until I finally found Landon standing near the windows, speaking with our director. He looked exactly as he always had, calm, confident, and warmly attentive to everyone around him. Yet for the first time I realized I could not imagine walking into this office without seeing him there. The reception began with a short speech from our director, who thanked Landon for his leadership and wished him success in Boston. Everyone applauded sincerely. Then several coworkers shared funny memories about projects they had completed together. Laughter filled the room, but I found myself standing unusually still. Every story reminded me that the person everyone admired professionally had quietly become the person who mattered most to me personally. Halfway through the celebration, Landon was invited to say a few words. He thanked the team with his usual humility, expressing gratitude for the friendships he had built and the experiences he would always remember. Then he paused for a moment before adding something unexpected. "There is one person here who changed my life in ways he probably never realized. Whether I stay or leave, I will always be grateful that our paths crossed." He never looked directly at me, yet somehow I knew exactly who he meant. The room applauded again, unaware of the deeper meaning behind his words. My heartbeat grew louder with every passing second. I suddenly remembered what my mother had said, what Rachel had reminded me, and every ordinary moment that had quietly transformed my life. I had spent weeks asking myself whether this changed my identity. The truth was much simpler. It changed my understanding of love. Before I could lose the courage that had taken so long to find, I stepped away from the wall and walked across the room. Conversations slowly faded as coworkers noticed me approaching. Landon turned toward me with quiet surprise. For a brief moment neither of us spoke. Then I smiled, feeling calmer than I had expected. "I have spent too much time trying to answer the wrong question," I said honestly. I kept asking myself what this meant about me. I should have been asking who I wanted beside me when I imagined the rest of my life. The room became completely silent. I took one more step forward. The answer has been standing in front of me for months. I looked directly into his eyes, no longer afraid of who might be listening. "I choose you, Landon." No dramatic reaction followed. There was only a long, quiet moment where the entire room seemed to stop breathing. Then Landon's expression softened into the warmest smile I had ever seen. He walked toward me slowly and said in a calm voice, "Nathan, that is all I ever hoped to hear." Around us, several coworkers exchanged surprised smiles before gentle applause gradually filled the room. Melissa quietly wiped away a happy tear while our director smiled with genuine warmth. Nothing about the moment felt uncomfortable or theatrical. It felt honest. As the applause faded, Landon leaned slightly closer and quietly whispered something only I could hear. "There is one more decision I have not made yet, and it depends entirely on what we do after we leave this room together." After everyone slowly returned to their conversations, Landon and I stepped outside onto the rooftop terrace overlooking downtown Seattle. The afternoon sun reflected against the glass buildings while a cool autumn breeze carried away the last of the nervousness I had been holding for months. We stood beside the railing in comfortable silence until Landon smiled and repeated the words he had whispered only moments earlier. The Boston position is still available, but I have not signed anything yet. I looked at him with quiet surprise. You have not made your final decision? He shook his head. No. I wanted to be honest with you before I decided what the next chapter of my life would look like. I laughed softly, realizing how much had changed in such a short time. For weeks I thought the hardest question was whether I was still the person I believed I had always been. Landon listened without interrupting. Now I understand that I was asking the wrong question. I kept trying to define myself instead of listening to what my heart had been telling me all along. He smiled with the same calm kindness that first caught my attention months earlier. And what is your heart telling you now? I looked out across the city before answering honestly. It is telling me that the person I want beside me is you. The label never mattered as much as I thought it did. You matter. Neither of us rushed the moment. There were no dramatic promises, no impossible declarations, only two people finally speaking without fear. Landon nodded gently. Then I already know my decision. The following Monday morning our director gathered the department for a brief announcement. Everyone expected to hear that Landon would be relocating to Boston. Instead he smiled and explained that after careful consideration he had decided to remain in Seattle because the life he wanted to build was already here. The room erupted into applause. Melissa laughed and said she had secretly hoped he would stay. Even our director admitted he was relieved not to lose one of the strongest leaders on the team. Life slowly settled into a new rhythm after that. Surprisingly, very little changed on the surface. We still worked together, still argued playfully about which coffee shop served the best espresso, still spent Saturday mornings browsing independent bookstores and Sunday afternoons hiking nearby trails whenever the weather cooperated. The difference was not found in grand gestures. It lived in the quiet certainty that neither of us had to hide our feelings anymore. My parents welcomed Landon with genuine warmth the first time he joined us for dinner, and my mother smiled at me across the table with the same knowing expression she had worn weeks earlier on the back porch. Rachel laughed when I finally admitted she had been right all along. Even Tyler shook his head with an amused grin and said, I knew something was different the first time you spent an entire dinner talking about one coworker. Months later, while walking through the same independent bookstore where an elderly cashier had once mistaken us for a couple, we saw her again. She looked at us, smiled warmly, and said, I had a feeling I would see you two together again. This time I smiled back without hesitation. You noticed something long before I did. She wished us well before returning to her work, leaving us both laughing as we walked toward the front door carrying two new mystery novels. Looking back now, I realize I never stopped being myself. I simply stopped allowing fear to answer questions that only honesty could resolve. Love did not ask me to become someone different. It asked me to recognize the person who had quietly stood beside me through ordinary mornings, shared laughter, difficult conversations, and countless small acts of kindness. In the end, I did not choose a label in front of everyone. I chose the person who had already become my safest place, and that single choice gave me a future more genuine, peaceful, and joyful than anything I had ever imagined possible.